Continuing on with a series of season critiques, we've made it to season 7. From the title you can see I'm not particularly fond of this season, and I was kinda surprised that through this poll I ran, most people didn't necessarily dislike the season. For this analysis, I'll go into 3 main aspects as to why I think it's so bad, which all relate to the writing, and to me, that was the primary culprit of this season. Also, a lot of people critiquing the show just say that the writing in general is just bad as a vague term, but for this video I'll go into depth about which aspects of the writing have declined. First, we have the writing being rushed. And this is obviously a general statement to make, but this flaw leads to a lot of negative side effects, which are the pacing being overtly fast, a lack of intriguing dialogue to slow down that pace, not developing and exploring the subplots to their full potential, or just straight up abandoning plotlines altogether. Before I dive deeper into those flaws and show examples, I'll briefly explain why the writing was rushed in the first place. Since David and Dan by this time were becoming very popular, they were getting massive offers from Netflix and Disney to make content for them. In response to that, and partially because of burnout, David and Dan decided to make 2 shortened seasons instead of the 10 seasons that HBO and George R. R. Martin wanted. Dumb and Dumber even refused the help of more writers from HBO and wanted to take practically full ownership of Game of Thrones. This paired with a lack of source material led to a downfall in the writing. Now, this brings us back to the side effects of that rushed writing. The first side effect is the issue of pacing. Generally, the speed of the pace for a show or movie is determined by how fast you move through the plots. In season 7, we have so many story events that are crunched into just 7 episodes. Meanwhile, in the earlier seasons, we would have like a few major story events in the course of 10 episodes. And why is this a bad thing, you may ask? Well, that's because you need to have a good balance of build-up and payoff, and to also have enough time for your characters to grow. A prime example of perfect pacing is in season 2, where throughout the King's Landing subplot, Tyrion is learning how to be a great hand, while also being tasked with taking on the massive obstacle of defending King's Landing from Stannis. That is proper build-up to a major story event that thoroughly develops Tyrion as a character. But if the King's Landing subplot was similar to season 7, we would have Tyrion defending the kingdom, having to marry Sansa, and then being accused of Joffrey's death, and being tried for it. This is how season 7 is for Daenerys. She arrives to Dragonstone, goes through numerous battles, meets the King of the North and falls in love with him, has to save everyone from the White Hunt, and meets with Cersei for a ceasefire all in the course of 1 season. That's pretty nuts. And any scenes we get with her that includes dialogue is mostly Tyrion saying repetitive stuff like, "Don't burn down King's Landing, forehead, and don't use your dragons at all."
You'd be flying around the open seas alone for who knows how long.
I wouldn't be alone. I would have Drogon, Viserion, and Rhaegal. What can anyone do to them?
Which always leads to the same outcome of Dany hating Tyrion and ignoring his idiotic advice. That's not character development. Actually think about it, how does Daenerys change as a character throughout season 7? Really, the only major change to her is her falling in love with Jon Snow and seemingly becoming more compassionate. And again, that's extremely rushed. You're telling me these 2 people fell in love in practically 4 scenes? Along with Jon Snow being one of the main reasons her dragon got killed? Going from Daenerys being the most depressed she's probably ever felt at the loss of a child, to then having the hots for Jon in the course of 20 minutes is like emotional whiplash from cracked pacing. You need to slow down the pace so that the characters can breathe and express how they feel. Make it to where Daenerys is in a dark place and Jon pulls her out of the depths of depression, and that's how they fall in love. That could also act as proper foreshadowing to the Mad Queen arc, but yeah, I doubt David and Dan actually thought that much about it. Another issue with the pacing is that we don't really have a lot of in-between scenes to make it seem like time has passed. For example, in season 1 when most of our characters are traveling to King's Landing, there are a lot of scenes along the journey to portray the passage of time, along with having great character and world building dialogue in those scenes. But if you think about that journey, they get from Winterfell to King's Landing in just 1 episode. Meanwhile in season 7, all the main characters teleport to King's Landing for the ceasefire negotiations between the transition of 1 episode. The reason why this passage of time feels contrived is that there are no in-between dialogue scenes during that journey. And that's a massive missed opportunity given how many main characters were on the ship heading to King's Landing. The possibility for riveting dialogue scenes were endless. But again, since David and Dan are rushing to their conclusion and overall story events, the pacing is artificially fast when it should be slower with the inclusion of more intriguing dialogue like the earlier seasons. For another side effect of rushed writing, we have the underdevelopment of subplots or just abandoning them altogether. For this point, I'll jump right into an example, and that's the underdevelopment of Cersei's subplots. Throughout Season 6, David and Dan seem to be alluding to there being a big uprising.
Every one of us is poor and powerless, and yet together, we can overthrow an empire.
You might find it difficult to rule over millions who want you dead. Half the city will starve when winter comes, the other half will plot to overthrow you. The queen slaughters babies.
So when Cersei destroys the Sept and everyone seemingly hates her, there's a big opportunity to further develop that subplot to show the difficulties of running a kingdom while everyone hates you. But instead for Season 7, that whole potential area of conflict vanishes, and that leaves a very limited number of scenes for Cersei, since now her only relevancy to the story is fighting Daenerys. The way this ties into the writing being rushed is that David and Dan just didn't give themselves enough time to properly tie up all the loose ends, so they just wanted to focus on the main storyline. This also plays into heavily simplifying different aspects of the story to make it easier to write, like not utilizing time travel with Bran's powers, or anything besides crows really, Arya's whole faceless assassin skill set, the Azor Ahai prophecy, overall magic, and numerous other abandoned plotlines. It's inherently easier to write a story with less complex elements at play, along with dozens of plotlines and different aspects of the story that you have to pay off. This in turn makes Season 7 significantly shallower and more superficial because with a selective focus on a couple areas of the story, it in turn makes the show seem much worse when compared to the earlier seasons when everything was thoroughly thought out and explored down to the finest details. Moving on to another glaring flaw in the writing is that it is extremely contrived. What I mean by this is that Dumb and Dumber forced different plot points in the story to happen with very little explanation or logic. The most prevalent example of this is the journey beyond the wall to kidnap a white. The overall logic behind this plot point makes practically no sense because in what world would Cersei of all people actually help her enemy? Especially considering that this plan is coming from Tyrion who quote-unquote understands his sister. But with this flawed and horrendous logic, we now have two big set pieces of action and drama that are suddenly forced into existence. Even if the story as according to George R. R. Martin was leading there, the execution was completely butchered by Dumb and Dumber. In getting there, they completely compromised Tyrion and the intellect of every character involved. Then if you look at the episode more closely, why didn't they just use Daenerys' dragons to fly in and swoop up some whites in the dragon's claws? Or at least use the dragon as a form of immediate extraction? How did Jon and his entourage think that they could get their hands on a white without any White Walkers noticing? Oh, because Dumb and Dumber wanted an epic action scene to instill a false sense of entertainment that is unearned. Then when zooming in even closer to examine the logistics of that action scene, literally every character should have died, but were protected by plot armor. How convenient that the Night King waited for the ice to refreeze for 24 hours when it was shown that the whites can just swim. Or how convenient that the Night King didn't harpoon Drogon, who was a much easier target to hit, and who had every main character on him that opposed him. Season 7 is basically packed to the literal brim with these types of moments and scenes filled with plot armor, contrivances, and conveniences. Like, let's have a big action scene where Daenerys rolls and smokes everyone with Drogon. Oh, but we don't want to kill Jaime yet, or have him get captured, so let's force a stupid scenario where he actually survives. And we would also like a scene where Tyrion and Cersei reunite to show off their acting chops, which requires Jon Snow to act like a dumbass. Overall, if most of the story events are forced into existence, then nothing feels natural and it calls attention to the characters doing stupid things to move the plot forward. It becomes a big issue of the story driving the characters, instead of the characters driving the story with their coherent decisions. For the last big issue of writing, we have the butchering of characters. In other words, Dumb and Dumber not knowing how to write the main characters at all. Which is kind of sad considering that by default, David and Dan had to be extremely familiar with the source material to have even gotten this far in making the show. But anyways, first we have Jon Snow. A character that has devolved into just parroting the same lines over and over and has no real character development past Season 6. This especially gets worse in Season 8, but it started in Season 7. All the dialogue that relates to his character solely exists to only move the plot forward. Either he'll drone on about needing to fight the Night King, needing more allies, or just needing anything the protagonists in general need.
When I left Winterfell, I told you we need allies or we will die. But more importantly, we need allies.
I told you we needed allies.
We need allies. Powerful allies.
If we're gonna be allies in this war, it's important for the Northerners to see us as allies.
A very shocking difference to how he was in the earlier seasons, where it felt like he had an actual personality. Next, we have Arya, a character who criminally has literally nothing to do the whole season. Dumb and Dumber sidelined her character in this stupid forced drama between her and her sister Sansa, which, again, links back to the contrived writing of forcing these two characters into a conflict that can easily be solved by Bran clearing up the confusion, which also happens off-screen to play up a contrived drama-enthused conclusion with Littlefinger where the audience doesn't know what's happening. Going back to Arya though, I don't know when she made the transition between being a psychopath who threatens her own sister more than the Lannister soldiers. That's pretty wild when you think about it. While we're here, we have Sansa, who similar to Arya, doesn't really have anything to do for the whole season. She becomes the acting queen of the North, but the show never gives her any obstacles to overcome while in that position to grow her character. The only obstacle is being Arya and Littlefinger, who seemingly was AFK for most of the season until they killed him. So, not a very interesting obstacle to begin with. Yet again, another character who has very minimal things to do thanks to the rushed writing. On to the next Stark child, we have Bran, a character who is now a complete douchebag who doesn't care about anything, which is solidified by the fact that he doesn't even thank Mira Reed for everything she's done. Like, come on man, seriously? Bran wasn't really that likable to begin with, but he now just becomes insufferable and has nothing to offer to the show but to tell people that Jon is a Targaryen. Which is just saddening from an audience perspective due to him not using any of his powers besides his apparent crow fetish. Moving over to Daenerys, she is for the most part unchanged, but any dialogue scenes with potential development are either romancing Jon or arguing with Tyrion. If anything, the scenes with Tyrion makes it feel like she's regressing because she's rightfully choosing to ignore his terrible advice. I guess the writers wanted to allude to her becoming angrier and doing her own thing, but in the process they ruined Tyrion. Which brings us to Tyrion, a character who was once the smartest in the show who now becomes just as intelligent as the person writing him. The fact that Tyrion doesn't have a single line of good advice as an advisor is pretty tilting. From telling Daenerys to not use her dragons instead of just using them strategically, assaulting Casterly Rock instead of, defending Highgarden, the most valuable place in Westeros due to how much food and money they have, wanting her to let everyone die beyond the wall because it's too dangerous, and actually thinking that Cersei would help them fight against the army of the dead, along with the plan to kidnap a White. The only good advice Tyrion really gave was to spare the Tarleys and to form an alliance with the North, but that doesn't salvage the behemoth amount of bad advice he's given. The worst part about all of this is that the show doesn't set up Tyrion to become more stupid, or however the hell that can happen to be honest. He does, however, become more worn down after killing his father, but that doesn't mean he loses his IQ. What I'm getting at here is, it would at least be understandable if there was a reason behind Tyrion's decline in brain functionality.
I suppose we should say goodbye. One idiot to another.
But it just comes across as Dumb and Dumber not being smart enough to write his character. So now that leaves us with just two more characters, Cersei and Jaime. For Cersei, in comparison to seasons 5 and 6, she takes a big step down. Because in those prior seasons, she was basically the protagonist of her own story, and she had a lot of great scenes that humanized her character and made us sympathize with her. But now, she's back as a primary antagonist, so she kind of loses those excess scenes that made us care for her as a character. There are a couple scenes with her having a romance with Jaime, which is fine, but the clear standout is her getting revenge on the Laria Sand. It's a fantastic scene, but it mostly acts as payoff for season 5, along with it giving more clout to Euron, which is never a good thing. But in general for this season, Cersei kind of becomes that stereotypical villain, and it feels like she loses the depth she had in the earlier seasons. Then finally we have Jaime Lannister. And surprisingly, this is the only character I liked in the season because he actually had a character arc. Not everyone needs a full-blown character arc in one season, and most of the time it happens over the span of multiple seasons. But none of the other main characters really have that over seasons 7 and 8, especially since the writing just gets worse. But going back to Jaime, at the start of season 7, he's mostly devoted to Cersei, and by the end, he decides to fight for what is right and defend the living from the dead. I think that's an overall good transition, and it stays true to his character being honorable. He was also involved with the spoils of war, and in that battle, I think Jaime offered a great perspective to how devastating Daenerys can be in war, despite him having a contrived exit from that sequence. But overall, a lot of the characters take a dramatic downturn in quality, whether it's doing stupid things that are out of character or becoming so dull that they're just unlikable. It creates a massive divide for fans following and loving these characters, and it's especially noticeable when they used to be much better. Writing, in essence, is the basic foundation of shows and movies, and if it's fundamentally flawed, then the end result of the show is just going to be bad, no matter how pretty the special effects are or how cool the action may seem. I think the grounded and realistic tone in the first 4 seasons are much better than the bombardment of action scene after action scene, and the story moving at ludicrous speed. The slow-paced, detailed nature with the occasional build-up to an epic action scene is peak Game of Thrones enjoyment for me, and not what Season 7 is. I can understand why some people may say that the season is okay, but I just think it's thrusted into the bad region primarily because of the writing. Regardless though, I hope you enjoyed the video, and let me know what you think about Season 7 in the comments.